everyone, and welcome to Toronto Stories Live. My name is Nadine Villacine-Feldman. I'm the Director of Programming at Museum. I'm a Filipino woman with dark hair that is in a short bob about chin length, and I'm wearing a black short sleeve top. I'm sitting on a green couch surrounded by lots of different cushions. For those of you who are new to Museum, we are a museum that shares the diverse stories of Toronto, connecting our city's history to current issues and ideas. And as the Director of Programming, it is my work and our work here at Museum to consider what it means to make space and hold space for the diverse stories and histories of Toronto. And because all of our stories are ultimately deeply rooted in our relationship to the land we live on, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the history of this land as the ancestral homelands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. And I'd like to honor their care and stewardship of this land from time immemorial and recognize that we benefit from the caretaking efforts of those who have come before us as we live and gather on the land today. For me, personally, recognizing this history challenges me to think about what my responsibilities are as a first-generation immigrant to honor the Dish with One Spoon covenant, which predates settler treaties and reminds all of us, settler, immigrant, newcomer, those forcibly brought by the transatlantic slave trade, and the diverse Indigenous peoples who live here today, of our individual and collective responsibility to develop and maintain a healthy relationship with the land. Remembering the history of this land also challenges me to think about the settler impacts on our relationship to the land and to one another. How does this history affect how we tell our stories? How does it inform which stories we choose to tell? And as a programmer, of course, I'm inspired to think about how the stories we share today might contribute to the writing of relations amongst ourselves and with the land and serve the 7 generations that follow us. For tonight's program, Toronto Stories Live, we approached 4 storytellers with a simple request: to share with us an important person, place, or event in Toronto's history. And what they came back to us with was a mix of stories that are personal, political, humorous, and seminal. We are very pleased to be presenting the following stories tonight: the story of Jean Lumb, as told by Arlene Chan; the election that changed Toronto, told by John Lorinc; Daphne Odjig, told by Bonnie Devine; and the Binational Lesbian Conference, told by Rebecka Sheffield. Before we begin, we just wanted to share some additional information about tonight's program. This program is an hour-and-a-half long, and a full recording of this event will be available a few weeks following the program, as well as videos for each story. So we invite you to please feel free to take breaks as you need them. This program consists of live introductions from each storyteller, followed by their recorded Toronto story, each of which are about approximately 10 minutes in length. We will be finishing the program with a 20-minute question and answer period with all the 4 storytellers, so please be sure to enter your questions in the Q&A box along the way. Feel free to do that throughout the program. Please note that each recorded story includes captions, and there are live captions available for the live portions of this event. Instructions on how to activate the live captions for introductions and the Q&A will be in the Zoom chat. So I would strongly encourage you to pop open the chat box during this program, as that's where we like to share things like bios, definitions, and resource links for deeper learning. And it's also a wonderful way to share your thoughts and interact with our storytellers, as well as your fellow audience members. And now to begin our program, I'd like to invite Arlene Chan, author and award-winning Chinatown historian, to come on camera and introduce her story about her mother, Jean Lumb.
Thank you so much, Nadine. Hello, everyone. My name is Arlene Chan, and I'm a 3rd-generation Chinese Canadian who grew up in Toronto's Chinatown. I am someone who has shoulder-length hair that is getting grayer by the day, and I'm wearing a dress with a red scarf to bring good luck and good fortune to our program. And I do know that it's going to be a very successful program. I'm enjoying my years as a senior, pursuing my passion for writing, researching, and talking about the Chinese in Canada. Jean Lumb is in the spotlight, and she's not only my mother, but more significantly, she's a woman who spoke up and made a difference on behalf of the Chinese community. David Crombie, our former mayor of Toronto, was a friend of my mother and remains to this day a friend of our family. He recently described my mother as having that drive to push above and beyond any barriers. She always forged ahead, despite so many challenges, to realize her dream of inclusion, being inside the circle of Canadian life. I'm going to share her story, sometimes in my own words, with narration describing photos of my mother at various stages of her life, and giving some historical context with archival photos of early Chinese and the Chinese community here in Toronto. At other times, you'll hear my mother in her own words. Quotes from oral histories, a documentary film clip of an interview, as well as footage taken at her restaurant, the Kwong Chow Chop Suey House. I hope you enjoy my presentation. She sparkled, she bedazzled. To say that my mother, Jean Lumb, was one of a kind is an understatement. She was renowned as a champion of dynamic energy who fought for gender and ethnic equality and advocated for self-representation of Chinese Canadians. She was the go-to person and interpreter of Chinese thoughts, feelings, and needs, bridging that space, that huge space that existed at that time between Chinese Canadians and the community outside of Chinatown. Where did it all begin? She was born into a close-knit family with 12 siblings. And at that time, it was really very rare because the ratio of Chinese men to women was 10-1. Now, my grandfather, Jean's father, arrived in 1899. And a few years later, he was one of the few Chinese men at the time who was able to bring over his wife, my grandmother. So again, having this family in 1919, when my mother was born, eventually having 12 brothers and sisters was a rare occurrence. Life for any Chinese living in the sleepy town of Nanaimo, BC, where my mother was born, or any other place in Canada was challenging. In BC alone, there were over 100 anti-Chinese policies and laws that barred, segregated, and restricted the Chinese in Canada. It was Jean's humble beginnings and her sense of feeling outside the circle of Canadian life that paved the way for her future as a woman of many firsts.
My mother had 11 children in Canada, and I'm number 6 of the family of 12. I got put into grade 4, and then I skipped, and I got into grade 6, and then next thing you know, I was 12 years old. And as much as I loved going to school, there was a change in the family plan. One of my sisters got married, and it was during the Depression, and my father thought that I should leave school and go to work. Chinese family, of course. As father said, the boys need the education because they have to make a living to look after their family. Girls get married, and their husbands would have to look after you. So therefore, education to the girl is not as important as the boys. When I was told to quit school, I cried. And my father said to my mother, I didn't know Jean was going to take it so hard. So my father came in and talked to me. He said, Jean, I know it's very hard on you, but you don't worry. After school, you can learn from your brother's homework. For the Chinese school, I'll teach you at home. And I learned more from him in Chinese than my brothers and sisters did. We lived in a Chinatown area where we don't see anybody else except Chinese people. That we weren't allowed almost to go downtown where the white people were. I had to go to a segregated school, which I was not happy at all. So I think in those days, I felt I was out there, looking in on the playground, that I feel that I'm not in there. So there seemed to be a circle that's keeping me out. And I said, I wish one day that I would be inside the circle instead of being out here. I said, maybe if I had blonde hair and a different, my face could be a little more white, I could go to those schools then, and I only wish that once, that I wasn't from my father and my mother's family, that I had blonde hair, but just for that once little while, I felt that, wouldn't it be nice if I was a blonde and I can go to these schools and be inside the circle instead of outside the circle.
At age 16, during the Great Depression in the 30s, Jean was sent by her parents to work for her married sister in Toronto. And when Jean arrived in Toronto, there was such a small Chinese community, only about 2,000. Chinatown was located downtown in what was called St. John's Ward, or the Ward. A few women and only a dozen or so families made up a disproportionately male population, the result of the head taxes that discouraged Chinese immigration from 1885 until 1923, and the subsequent exclusionary law that outright banned Chinese immigrants from 1923 until 1947. The ratio of men to women was 18-1. And for someone from a huge, loving family, Jean was dismayed by the absence of family life. Her wedding to my father, Doyle Lumb, a few years later in 1939, resulted in the loss of her citizenship, another example of Canada's harsh laws. Even though she was born in Canada, she had to take on her husband's official status. And because my father was born in China, he was classified as alien. Decades later, the tide turned and came full circle. Jean regained her citizenship and was later appointed a citizenship judge who administered the oath of citizenship to hundreds of new Canadians. World War II was a really huge turning point in Chinese Canadian history. After the war, the Chinese gained the right to vote across Canada, and with that right to vote, they could now run for public office and enter in professions like medicine and law. The exclusionary law was repealed in 1947. However, there remained so many restrictions that prevented the Chinese from bringing their wives and children to Canada. Jean fought to bring more changes to ease family reunification. As the only female who was directed by the male delegates to sit at the back and be quiet as a mouse, she ended up being the spokesperson at a meeting with Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. In her words, "When we got there, Fun Sin, the official spokesperson, was seated next to Mr. Diefenbaker. But Mr. Diefenbaker insisted that I sit next to him, since I was the only woman delegate. Mr. Diefenbaker had one bad ear, the one next to Wong Fun Sin. So every time Fun Sin read from the brief, Mr. Diefenbaker would ask me what he said. Since I knew that brief inside out, I explained to him what had just been said." The questions from the floor were mostly directed to me because of the fact that I was a woman and the issue was family reunion. I feel very lucky that I had the opportunity to be out front as an official spokesperson. Women have always had to be too much in the background. Jean continued to make great strides for her community. She served as the president of numerous Chinese women's groups, trustee for a Chinese school, and only female member of the Chinese Community Centre of Ontario. After New City Hall was opened in 1965, at the expense of 2/3 of Chinatown being demolished, Jean headed the Save Chinatown Committee to ward off further expropriation. What was left of Chinatown was saved. The Kwang Chow, the restaurant that my parents owned in Chinatown, attracted well-known diners from prime ministers and politicians to movie stars. There, Jean built a network of distinguished and influential clientele who helped seal her position as the unofficial mayor of Chinatown. She raised awareness about her community, breaking labels and stereotypes portrayed and perpetuated by the public, media, and elected officials. The once marginalized Chinatown became a popular destination rather than an area to avoid. This banquet at the Kwang Chow restaurant was attended by Mayor Nathan Phillips, Prime Minister John Diefenbaker learning how to use chopsticks, and Member of Parliament Roland Michener, later appointed the Governor General of Canada. As another way to introduce Chinese culture to the larger community, Jean established a Chinese dance troupe. Performances around the city and across Canada culminated in a command performance for Queen Elizabeth II on the occasion of Canada's centennial celebration on Parliament Hill in 1967. So as if running a restaurant, raising 6 children, and managing a dance troupe were not enough. Despite the cultural tides of the times, she extended her volunteerism outside her community, breaking glass ceilings in a line of many firsts. First Chinese woman on the boards of Women's College Hospital, Mount Sinai Hospital, University Settlement House, and the Rotary Lachlan Centre. And she was also the first woman and first Chinese Canadian to receive the Fran Deck Award for Outstanding Achievement in Toronto's restaurant industry. She was inducted into the Order of Canada as the first Chinese Canadian woman and first restaurateur ever in 1976. After decades of tireless pioneering, my mother died in 2002 at the age of 82. Her lifelong work on behalf of her community gave voice to the injustices of racism and discrimination. The ups and downs in the life of a small town girl from Nanaimo transformed her into a larger-than-life woman whose childhood dream of being inside the circle was realized. Driven by her passion and commitment to make a difference, Jean gave a voice for the voiceless, speaking up, telling untold stories, and creating a new narrative from a Chinese person's perspective to help her community fully and equally participate in Canadian life. Her legacy lives on through our family, the Jean Lumb Foundation that awards high school students of Chinese heritage from across Canada, a commemorative provincial plaque that is situated in our first Chinatown, about a block south of where the Huang Chao restaurant was, the Jean Lumb Lane that runs south off Dundas in West Chinatown, and the Jean Lumb Public School, the highest honor that pays tribute to her lifelong commitment to education. She is remembered and respected for her intelligence, leadership, and strength of character, for building bridges, dismantling barriers, and advocating for an inclusive country. The power of one voice can be a transformative agent of change. Jean Lumb has taken her rightful place as a Canadian who made a difference.
Thank you, Arlene, for sharing your family's story and your mother's legacy with us all. Next, we have John Lorinc, a Toronto journalist, author, and editor, who will introduce his story about the 1955 mayoral election in Toronto.
Thank you, Nadine. Just to give you a bit of a description, I'm sitting in my office, which is a big mess. I have kind of short, grayish, reddish hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a blue sweater. So what I do for a living is I'm a freelance writer and editor. I cover City Hall and I write about urban affairs for a bunch of different publications, and I'm a senior editor at Spacing Magazine. I also do a lot of work with Coach House Books, publishing anthologies about different aspects of the history of the city. And I've had actually the great privilege of working with all of the other panelists, Rebecka and Bonnie and Arlene, on different anthologies about different aspects of the city's history. So I am kind of I'm fascinated by how Toronto became the city that it is today. So my parents arrived here as refugees without any money or any clothes except for what they were wearing in 1956. And that's approximately the same moment as the story that I'm going to tell in the video in a moment. As I mentioned, I write a lot about urban politics and municipal politics, and most people don't know anything at all about municipal politics in Toronto before the 1960s. Most of our mayors were not very memorable. There are a couple that have their names on boats and stadiums, but for the most part, it was not a particularly illustrious group. And then there was this election in 1955 between Leslie Saunders and Nathan Phillips. And that election was a turning point. And it also kind of coincides with a kind of a turning point in the way the city functioned. And, Arlene has told a really important chapter of that story about the growing sort of self-confidence and the emancipation of the Chinese Canadian community in the 60s and 70s. There's more sort of, inclusion that will come with the LGBT community and the Indigenous communities. And so this story is about the politics of the city and why this one election kind of altered the politics of Toronto for good. Thank you very much for watching. The 1954 Toronto mayoral campaign featured a showdown between two municipal stalwarts, Leslie Saunders and Nathan Phillips. Both were Tories, and both had served at City Hall for decades. In that era, mayoral elections took place every year. Generally, Toronto's early chief magistrates weren't important political leaders. With a few, their names survived because they adorned stadiums or ferries. Most, however, have been forgotten, leaving no particular legacy. That year's race, however, offered something different, a dynamic that seemed well suited to a period of rapid post-war change. Saunders represented the old guard, and specifically the Orange Order, a defiantly anti-Catholic fraternity that traced its roots to the immigration to Toronto of Ulster Protestants from Northern Ireland. The Orangemen were intensely conservative, more British than the British, as the saying went, and had dominated local government for decades. Phillips, though he had served for many years as an alderman and a controller, exemplified a very different outlook. A glad-handing lawyer from Brockville, Phillips was Jewish. His religion hadn't hurt his political career, but Toronto, known as the Queen's City, had never elected a Catholic mayor, much less a Jewish one. The unexpected outcome of their dramatic showdown was to reset the city's politics forever. During the post-war years, Toronto was making space for thousands of returning soldiers and therefore faced acute housing shortages. The baby boom was fueling suburban expansion as well as post-war prosperity and consumerism. The city had also become the destination for tens of thousands of immigrants and refugees, veterans and their Dutch or British war brides, displaced persons from the concentration camps, as well as Poles, Italians, Germans, Ukrainians, Austrians, and other Central Europeans. Immigrants were changing Toronto. Born in London, England in 1899, Leslie Saunders arrived in Toronto via North Bay in 1928 and worked as the business manager for the Sentinel, which was the Orange Order's local paper and stridently anti-Catholic. He was elected to City Council in 1942, a time when 16 of 23 aldermen were Orangemen. The order traces its roots to William of Orange's victory over the Catholic army of King James II at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. In Northern Ireland, Orangemen paraded through Catholic neighborhoods, inciting riots and sectarian violence. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Toronto was sometimes described as Canada's Belfast for its staunchly Orange culture, which featured nepotism, anti-papist rhetoric, and Orange Day parades, though little of the overt violence from the old country. Nate Phillips, as he was known, had a career as a litigator in Toronto and a garrulous, self-deprecating manner. His family traced its roots to some of the earliest Jewish settlers to Upper Canada. He joined the Conservative Party in his 20s and was elected to City Council in 1926, hoping to use that office as a stepping stone. Phillips ran 3 times for the provincial legislature in ridings around Spadina, but lost each race. He then ran unsuccessfully for mayor twice, against Alan Lamport in 1951 and 1952, and finally decided to leave public life. The December 1954 election really began earlier that year, when the incumbent, Alan Lamport, resigned to become the chair of the TTC. Saunders, as deputy mayor, stepped in to fill his place. Not long afterwards, he released a statement on City of Toronto letterhead that exemplified the bellicose rhetoric for which the Orange Order was well known. He extolled the virtues of the city's Protestant base, quote, reminding Torontonians of their British heritage. Saunders even compared the Allied victory over the Nazis to William's 1690 triumph at the Battle of the Boyne, and announced a major parade to mark the day, July 12th. By the early 1950s, Toronto's Orange Order was waning in its influence. Orange lodges were losing members and closing. A younger generation didn't care about Boyne, nor did they see the benefits of joining. Saunders' move that summer irritated Catholics and moderate Orangemen and drew intense media condemnation, including from the Toronto Telegram, the Toryist of all the city's dailies. The only rivers that Leslie Saunders is expected to concern himself with as mayor of Toronto, the Telly scolded, are the Don and the Humber. Phillips threw his hat into the ring later in the fall in a raucous campaign that saw Sanders rail at the media and threaten to ban reporters from covering council sessions. Phillips responded by promising to begin work on a civic square and the Bloor Danforth subway, keep spending under control, and protecting the freedom of the press. With Saunders, quote, bouncing from one fiasco to the next, as Jamie Bradburn described the race in a 2010 article, the newspapers all endorsed Phillips, who won by a margin of almost 4,000 votes. Nate Phillips' mayoralty lasted just 7 years, to 1962, but it was a period of intense change. During that time, the City of Toronto became part of Metro, headed by the autocratic Tory power broker and builder, Frederick Gardner. As he finessed that complicated political relationship, Phillips made a point of attending as many public events as he could. Indeed, his relentless professional social calendar became not just a calling card, but a quirk for which he was satirized. As is well known, Phillips unexpectedly intervened in the staid design competition to build a new city hall and set in motion the search for an international architect and a marquee design that would put modern Toronto on the world map. But perhaps Phillips' most important legacy flowed from a line that he used to describe his position. He promised to be a, quote, mayor for all the people. The slogan, which is still in use, expressed an outlook that spoke to post-war Torontonians. The city, Phillips was saying, could no longer be the exclusive domain of the old Anglo majority, with its bigoted ideas about the role of the church and Protestant morality. As a Jew, he understood the geography of exclusion and therefore the importance of inclusion better than most. He projected an aspiration that endures to this day.
Thank you, John. Just a reminder to everyone who's joined us, if you have any questions for our storytellers this evening, please remember to submit your questions at the bottom of your Zoom screen using the Q&A function. We'll end this evening with a Q&A with all the storytellers. I'd now like to invite Bonnie Devine, installation artist, video maker, curator, writer, and educator, to introduce her story about the artist Daphne Odjig.
Hello, everybody. My name is Bonnie Devine. I'm an Anishinaabe artist, writer, and other things. I'm wearing a black blouse with cactuses all over it. I have dark hair tied to one side, and my background has a pink moose, of all things, in the upper corner. Today, I am delighted to tell you the story of Daphne Odjig, an Indigenous artist who has been an inspiration to so many Canadian artists and storytellers during her 60-year career. Daphne was a pathmaker, an innovator, an organizer, and a role model who broke barriers for Indigenous artists and women with a fierce and fearless intelligence and creativity. Her life, in so many ways, traces a trajectory that many Indigenous people will recognize and identify with. As she learned how to discard the fear of the racism and rejection she'd experienced as a young woman and claim her Indigenous heritage with all her heart. Daphne's story will be illustrated with images of her paintings. So in a way, Daphne is telling her story herself. And of course, that was Daphne's way. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy hearing Daphne's story. Daphne Odjig was born at Wikwemikong First Nations territory on Manitoulin Island, Ontario, on September 11, 1919. She was the oldest of 4 children born to Dominic and Joyce Odjig. She and her siblings, Stanley, Donald, and Winnie, grew up in the loving care of her parents and paternal grandfather, Jonas, in a distinctive stone house in the little town of Wikwemicong. Daphne's mother, Joyce, was an English war bride who had met and married Dominic Odjig while he was serving overseas with the Canadian Forces during World War I. She returned with him to his home on Manitoulin Island after the war. The family was musical, athletic, and artistic. Daphne played the guitar, danced, and competed in community track and field events. She was an avid student at the Jesuit Mission School in Wikwemicong until she contracted rheumatic fever in 1932 when she was 13 years old and had to leave school to convalesce. Her grandfather, Jonas, an accomplished stone carver, took over her education and taught her drawing and visual composition. Jonas's visual influence can be seen in the dominant curvilinear lines of Odjig's drawings and paintings, lines that recall the marks a carver would scribe on a rock. Daphne's mother and grandfather died within months of one another in 1938, and the family's life was thrown into turmoil. Daphne left Manitoulin Island with her younger sister, Winnie, to seek work on the mainland. The pair stayed in Parry Sound for a time, then moved to Toronto. The outbreak of World War II had created new jobs for young women, and Daphne was able to work at several factory jobs to support herself and Winnie. Meanwhile, she spent her evenings and weekends drawing at the Royal Ontario Museum and the Toronto Art Gallery, teaching herself to paint by copying the works of famous artists there. This picture, Roots, currently hangs in the Lieutenant Governor's office at Queen's Park. It's a triptych, a series of 3 connected panels painted in 1979. The first panel shows Daphne as a little girl at Wikwemicong in the circle of her loving family, ancestors, and protective spirits. Note the small tree on the right of the panel. In the middle panel, that tree is uprooted as Daphne sets out for Toronto. Here she worked to support herself and her sister and met and married her first husband, Paul. Can you see how Daphne paints the tree as a transforming being amid motifs of distress and new beginnings? The third panel on the right shows the tree well planted and thriving as Daphne establishes a new home and a loving family in British Columbia. In 1964, Daphne was invited to return to Wikwemicong to attend the community's 4th annual powwow. This was a relatively new experience, for such ceremonial and celebratory events had long been outlawed by the Canadian government. She initially hesitated when asked to join in the dancing. It felt so strange and foreign. But when at last she moved into the circle with her relatives, something in her spirit awoke. You see, she had put aside many of the teachings and lifeways of her Indigenous forebears. She had even changed her name from Odjig to Fisher to better fit into Canadian society. But when she began to dance to the beat of the drum, with her family around her that day, she said she suddenly realized who she was and where she came from. I became an Indian, she told me. From 1964 on, Daphne's art focused on Indigenous heritage, traditions, beliefs, and stories, and the cultural awakening she envisioned for her family, community, and people. From then on, she put away the anglicized name Fisher and signed her paintings Odjig. And she began to understand her art's potential to preserve her culture and renew her community's purpose and pride. When her sister-in-law invited her to visit the elders on various communities on Manitoulin Island and record their stories, legends, and memories, Daphne enthusiastically agreed. Her efforts resulted in a compilation of 10 illustrated children's books called The Legends of Nanabush, published in 1971. The little books were still in use until very recently as reading primers in the elementary school at Wikwemicong and were reissued for general readers in 2009. In 1966, Daphne and her second husband, a community development officer for the Canadian government, were posted to Easterville in northern Manitoba to assist a small community of Cree who had been displaced to make way for a hydroelectric dam project near Grand Rapids, Manitoba. Struck by the hardship and resilience she saw there, Daphne made a series of pen and ink drawings to document the difficult living conditions the people were enduring. Her experience at Easterville changed her perception and her work. She saw the injustice and inequality around her and began to paint about it. She also noticed the hardship the trees and the animals were experiencing near her home in central British Columbia, where large-scale lumber harvesting was decimating the old-growth forests. She developed a distinctive landscape style that incorporated trees as living, sentient beings and the land as a sensitive participant in our human lives. Odjig was one of the first Canadian artists to actively advocate for ecological responsibility, creating a large body of work based on her observations and concerns. This picture from 1986 expresses her sense of the importance and beauty of trees and forests as communities of individuals with just as much right to life and freedom as human beings. She was also deeply interested in telling the history of her people, a history too often ignored in school curricula or history books. Daphne painted this picture, a monumental mural more than 30 feet long, titled The Indian in Transition, in 1978. It was commissioned by the Canadian Museum of History, but was not actually installed in the museum's public gallery until 2006. Before then, it hung rather obscurely near the ceiling of the museum's library. The mural shows the progression of Indigenous history in North America, from a place of harmony and tradition on the left, to the coming of the Europeans, to the dominance of the church, the residential school system, and the social harm and loss they caused, to a time of cultural renewal and restored harmony on the far right. She explored this theme of community and individual recovery from the predations of colonialism in many drawings and paintings. In this piece, Spiritual Renewal, 1984, which is organized as 2 panels, a diptych, we see the dominance of the church on the left and the resurgence of the drum, the dance, and the use of medicines on the right. Daphne's message was always clear, that the way forward for our people must involve reaching back to the old knowledge, the old practices, and the ever-present spirits, who are represented by the resplendent blue bird on the far right of the picture. Over the course of her life, Daphne Odjig received many public acknowledgements and awards, recognizing her commitment to the story of our people, both the beauty and the value of our nations and our histories, and the injustices and harms we still need to overcome. Among these many awards are included numerous honorary degrees from Canadian universities, a Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts, and the highest civilian honor our country can bestow, an Order of Canada. A retrospective exhibition of Daphne's works, surveying 60 years of her active artistic production, toured Canada and the USA from 2007 until 2010. The exhibition was organized by the Art Gallery of Sudbury and the National Gallery of Canada, and was curated by me. Here is Daphne at the National Gallery in 2010, with artist Joseph Sanchez steering her wheelchair, and her son, Stanley Somerville, standing beside her. What a proud and happy day that was. In preparation for her retrospective exhibition, Duke Redbird was commissioned to write a poem for inclusion in the exhibition catalog. We're honored that he has agreed to contribute a reading of his poem to this story of Daphne's life.
Ani, Bojo, Sego, Tanse, greetings. I'm Dr. Duke Redbird, an artist and poet. I'm a father, grandfather, great-grandfather, and elder from the Saugeen Ojibwe First Nation. Daphne Odjig, who lived from 1919 to 2016, is regarded as the grandmother of Aboriginal art. Daphne Odjig said that if her art has opened doors between Native and non-Native Canadians, then I am glad. I am even more deeply pleased if it has helped to encourage the young people to express their pride in our heritage more openly, more joyfully than I would ever have dared to think possible. In keeping with these sentiments of Daphne Odjig, I was inspired to write this poem called Miigwech and Thank You, Daphne Odjig. There is a place they call the Haunted Shore. It's a place where the ancient spirits dwell, and you can hear their voices singing like the ringing of a bell. And the echo washes over you in kayak or canoe, the swirling of the whitecaps, the howling of the wind. They take you on a journey to the past, then bring you back again. And there upon those ancient rocks, with simple brush and pen, our ancestors painted with red ochre as a medium. The people drew their legacy in colors and in line. The memory of 10,000 years eternally enshrined. Since then, those days have faded fast. Canoes and kayaks no longer journey to the haunted rocks to view the ancient past. Today, that world has been replaced by computers and cell phones, and we no longer seek the smoking fires of those ancient ones. The uncontaminated sanctuary that was their flesh and bones. Each generation that is born must walk a different path, guided by a map drawn by those whose destiny it is to document the past. On Manitoulin Island, where the great mystery dwells, Daphne Odjig was born in that sacred land, with a vision in her mind and a paintbrush in her hand. And as she wandered in meadows where the hawberry grows, she heard the stories that the wild creatures told. "Paint me," the voices cried. "Paint me as I once was. Paint me, our Mother Earth, and the people that she loves. Paint the embers that are burning, the wigwam that is well lit. Paint the milestones of our journey that is not over yet. Paint the challenges that face us, the struggles to be met. Paint the faith, the hope, and the visions of the past that we must not forget." Thank you, Daphne Odjig. Thank you, and Miigwech. Your canvases are a diagram etched in time, each painting stitched together like a patchwork quilt warms the dreaming spirit and gives guidance to the soul. Our children in the future may well walk among the stars in biospheres on Venus and on Mars, but they may never swim in the sparkling waters of a river, lake, or pond. Your paintings will be the memory of a universe that is gone, an echo from the past to which the future must respond. As our Mother Earth continues to evolve and the human family to exist, it is the artist who unveils our collective consciousness. We thank the Creator for giving us the privilege to witness such a gift. Thank you, Daphne Odjig. Thank you, and Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Bonnie, for sharing Daphne's story and her work. And of course, thank you to our friend Elder Duke Redbird and our great partner for Wigwam Chichamong for that beautiful poem. Next, we have our final storyteller for the evening, Rebecka Sheffield, an author and educator and information professional who's going to introduce her story about the 1979 Binational Lesbian Conference.
Thanks, Nadine. Hello, I'm Rebecka, and I'm so excited to be here tonight. I've been described as a tomboy, queer. I'm a white cisgender woman in my mid-40s, and my pronouns are she, her. Tonight, I'm wearing a black Henley t-shirt, black reading glasses, and I have rapidly graying short brown hair and blue eyes. You can't see them, but I love to smile, and I have laugh lines to show it. So tonight, I'm beaming into your screens from my home office in the city of Hamilton, but actually, I grew up in Treaty 6 territory, and that's Saskatoon. And my own experience of coming out in the prairies is likely what drew me to the story of the 1979 Binational Lesbian Conference that took place here in Toronto. So let me explain. In the 1970s, gay and lesbian people were really starting to develop a common identity and shared goals within an emerging social movement. And in the absence of things like the internet or even email, we were really trying to find ways to come together in one place to talk and learn and strategize. We found each other through printed newsletters, pen pal programs, and by telephone, if you can remember those. And in the 1970s, gays and lesbians started to organize and meet at these kinds of conferences across the country. One of the first large gatherings actually took place in Saskatoon in the summer of 1978, and it was called Metamorphosis and billed as a prairie celebration of lesbians and gay men. Now, I was only 2 when Metamorphosis happened, but I can tell you that the locals that I met later in the 1990s who did attend the conference carried with them such fondness and appreciation for this event. So years later, when I moved to Toronto and learned about the series of lesbian conferences that took place here and elsewhere, I wanted to learn more. And so thanks to my museum, I did get the chance to dive deeper into this history. And this is the story tonight that you'll hear. You'll learn about the social and political context that brought lesbians together in the spring of 1979 and why this conference is worth remembering. 1979 is an interesting time, somewhere between the partial decriminalization of homosexuality, just months before the raids on gay bathhouses that sparked massive protests, and a few years before the AIDS epidemic would really change the gay and lesbian movement forever. You'll also meet 2 delightful women, Robin Tyler and Shelley Robertson, who recall what it was like to live in this time and place. Before we roll the video, I also wanted to acknowledge that this week is Transgender Awareness Week, and I want to send love and gratitude to trans and non-binary people whose stories are part of the rich tapestry of queer histories in this city. So let it roll, Nadine. Hello, I'm Rebecka Sheffield, and I'm here to tell you the story of the 1979 Binational Lesbian Conference. Now, if you live in Toronto today, you're likely familiar with the annual Pride Festival that takes place here each June, culminating in a colorful parade celebrating two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, non-binary, and queer people. The Pride Festival grew out of a long history of activism and organizing for the social acceptance and human rights for 2S LGBTQ+ people. I want to tell you about one moment in that long history. I want to take you back to May 1979, when 400 women came to Toronto to take part in the very first Binational Lesbian Conference. For 3 full days of workshops, presentations, and discussion groups, lesbian women gathered together as one community that was distinct and special. But before I get to the point, and I do have one, I want to set the stage. In the 1970s, lesbian women were still mostly in the closet, afraid to disclose their sexuality for fear of losing jobs, housing, or even their own children. But things were starting to change. You see, 1979 sits at the tail end of a rather progressive period in Canadian history. Out on the streets, the gay liberation movement was in full swing, with many activists laser-focused on ending the police harassment of gay men. The women's movement was also thriving in the city of Toronto. Organizers, many of them lesbian women, had helped found women's centers, rape crisis centers, and daycare centers, as well as social spaces such as the Toronto Women's Bookstore and women's coffee houses. But lesbian women often found themselves caught between a predominantly male-centered gay liberation movement and a women's movement that seemed to prioritize straight women and their families. And it was in this context that a group of lesbians gathered together and decided to build a community space of their own, a safe, positive space in which lesbians could socialize, organize, and meet each other without fear of reprisal. And this is exactly what they did. In 1976, a group of women founded the Lesbian Organization of Toronto, LOOT, the first openly lesbian feminist group in the city. And soon after, they rented space in a house at 342 Jarvis Street. Now, LOOT didn't always get it right. In 1978, the organization affirmed its position that LOOT, which prided itself on being a women-only space, was not open to trans women, a decision that continues to cause division among lesbian feminists today. But what the organization did do was provide peer support, telephone counseling, participate in annual International Women's Day marches, manage a lending library, produce a newsletter, plan potluck socials, and promote concerts and performances by lesbian entertainers like Heather Bishop and Farron. You name it, LOOT did it. And this goes to show you that if you want to get something done, it's best to put a lesbian in charge. LOOT also hosted the 1979 Binational Lesbian Conference. Hey, see? We finally arrived at the story. In fall 1978, a group of LOOT members decided that they wanted to organize a conference to raise the visibility of lesbians. They began fundraising and planning a program that would bring together working class and middle-class lesbians and feminist intellectuals from across Canada. They even began to popularize a slogan, "What do you do with 1,000 lesbians?" I want that on a t-shirt. You see, the conference organizers were quite passionate. They believed that in order for lesbian women to achieve equality with men, they first needed to develop a strong, self-determined community of their own. To achieve this, women would have to learn skills and knowledge that had previously been the domain of men. At the same time, lesbian women needed opportunities to share ideas, work through contentious politics and disagreements, and build personal and professional competencies. And that's exactly what the 1979 conference was meant to do. Now, this wasn't the first lesbian conference. There had been a small gathering in 1973, and then another larger conference in Ottawa in 1976. This time, though, the organizers hoped the conference would be larger in focus and attract attendees from across the country. Oh, and it would be called binational, not just national. And this was because organizers wanted to recognize the growing Quebec sovereignty movement and include participation from Anglophone and Francophone women. LOOT booked space to host the conference at Hart House, a student activity center on the University of Toronto campus. It was only a few years prior, in 1972, that Hart House even began allowing women to become full club members. Conference organizers hoped to fill the whole building with lesbians. And they did. Though not quite as many as organizers had hoped, more than 400 women convened at Hart House on May 19, 1979. They came by foot, bicycle, bus, car, train, and even airplane from all corners of the country. On the first day, a Saturday, women arrived for an opening plenary and a day of workshops, with topics ranging from lesbian relationships to lesbians in prison. all offered in simultaneous French translation. One workshop dealt with motherhood. Now, this was a time when lesbian women routinely lost custody and had to fight the courts to even access their own children. Another workshop focused on minority lesbians and what we might now call intersectional identities. While lesbian feminism is often and rightfully criticized for centering the needs of white women, Black, Indigenous, and women of color were always part of and driving conversations and activism within the movement. The discussions continued into Sunday and were complemented by a series of skills sharing sessions. Participants could learn about basic car maintenance and bicycle repair, how to run a coffee house, and even self-defense techniques. Women were offered lunch, billeted accommodations, and even free daycare. Organizers really thought about everything. On Monday, May 21st, at a closing day plenary, Loot member Amy Gottlieb led a group of participants to draft a lesbian Bill of Rights. This manifesto attempted to awaken a new energy within the lesbian feminist movement. It stated, and I'll paraphrase a bit here, in the past decade, as many women came out, we have built communities and networks. We've taken a collective stride into the future. Let's let our militance and imagination lead us forward, always hoping that we will be respected for who we are. Phew, I've always admired Amy Gottlieb for her optimism. But let me pause here for a moment and reassure you that even among difficult times and challenging conversations, lesbians can have fun too. The conference organizers made sure to pepper the program with a range of social events. There was a percussion jam, an evening of theater, an art show, and even singing lessons. A highlight of the event was the Saturday night banquet and dance. Picture it. 600 women came out to the banquet room of the War Amps building at 62 Wellesley Avenue West to have dinner and dance the night away to the music of local favorite Mama Kia 2. Now, there was a long tradition of women's dances in Toronto. These were great spaces for lesbians to frolic and have fun, maybe even find a date. Mama Kia 2, named after the Inca goddess Mama Kia, was often the house band, fronted by singer Susan G. Cole and later Lorraine Segato, who would go on to form the Juno Award-winning Parachute Club with keyboardist Laurie Conger and drummer Billy Bryans. I can only imagine what it would have been like in that room among 600 lesbian women to feel the power of that community, a community that barely made a blip on the radar for most people living in Toronto at the time. The 1970s was really a period of lesbian identity in formation, and the conference was a clarion call for a more public and visible presence. You know, another highlight of 1979 was an event that featured the inimitable Robin Tyler. For those of you who don't know who Robin Tyler is, she was part of a comic duo, Harrison and Tyler. For nearly a decade, these two toured around the world, visiting small venues, colleges, and women's coffee houses. In 1979, Robin released an album called Always a Bridesmaid, Never a Groom, and made history by becoming the first out comic on American television, 20 years before Ellen DeGeneres would do the same. But I think even for Robin, the conference and the energy that it created by bringing together so many lesbian women in one place was, well, it was memorable. This is Robin and her childhood best friend, Shelley Robertson, a star in her own right. Shelley was an arts and entertainment editor for the Toronto Star. In 1979, Shelley accompanied Robin to U of T campus for the event, and this is what they remembered.
I remember that show because I had just completed Always a Bridesmaid, Never a Groom, and I remember that was one of my first performances of it. It was great because I was mirroring their experience. That's why comedy became so big in the women's movement and in the lesbian movement. It even outlasted folk music thank God, at some point. It's still around today because it really reflects our culture.
When the night was over and we were on our way home, we hopped in a cab. Robin had a girlfriend in Toronto, and we're heading for Robin's hotel where the two women will be dropped off. They are smooching in the back seat, And we are having a conversation about the evening and lesbian this, lesbian that, lesbian, 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 lesbian. That was the whole conversation until we got to the hotel. The two women got out, we said our good nights. When we get to my house, the cab driver turns to me and he says, "Would you like to go out for a cup of coffee?" I thought, are you deaf? I almost fell out of the cab. It was really, really, really funny. So that cemented that night in my head. It was a great evening.
So, 1979, while the Toronto lesbian community continued to develop in strength and diversity, the Binational Lesbian Conference gave women the opportunity to exchange ideas, share culture, and enjoy each other's company, sometimes intimately. They were, and we are, as the conference organizers proclaimed, united in armed snuggle.
Thank you so much, Rebecka. I love that we're united in armed snuggle. And thank you again to all of our storytellers. We are now moving on to the Q&A portion of the evening. So if you have any burning questions for our storytellers, now is the time to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I'd like to invite all the storytellers to come back on camera. We have some questions in the Q&A. So I will start off by asking, there is a question for Arlene, asking at what age you began to notice and appreciate the work that your mother was doing, and when did you decide that you wanted to document the history of Toronto's Chinatown?
I'm so embarrassed to answer this question and make a confession, because when my mother was so active, she was getting all this recognition from the community. She was winning awards. I was like a teenager. So that, you know how, if you remember back to your teenage days, the whole world revolves around you. And so, you know, my mom would come home and say, "Oh, I've just been, you know, given the Governor General's Award." And I said, "Oh, that's nice, Mom. So what's for dinner tonight?" You know, that kind of, I just didn't appreciate at all what she was doing and the impact that she was making, and how she was breaking barriers left, right, and center. So it wasn't until I was in my adult years, and this whole fascination that I have and passion that I have for the history of the Chinese in Canada and in Toronto, it's something that I started when I was actually quite young, because it was all part of my identity. Am I a Chinese? Am I a Canadian? Am I a Chinese Canadian? So all of that made me really focus a lot on our Chinese Canadian history. And of course, when I was doing any research in those early years, starting in high school, there was nothing written about the Chinese in Canada. So it was like there was a total vacuum out there. So, and then I was always going to the library. I became a librarian, but I was always going to the library to see if I could find a heroine, somebody that I could look up to, and here I was living with a heroine, but I didn't even know it, because again, I'm so embarrassed to admit this, but and it's just I can say in the last 20 years that I really, really appreciate what my mother did for the community, and this whole thing of her being outside the circle, and something that she realized before she passed away in 2002. So that's my confession for the day.
Thank you, Arlene. There's a question for you, John, which you answered in the Q&A, but I'm wondering if you can expand on a little bit. The question asks, what about Toronto exists? What else about Toronto exists today because of Nathan Phillips?
So I spoke to David Crombie, who was mentioned earlier, about Phillips, because Crombie said that when he was a new mayor, Phillips would often sort of drop by his office and offer unsolicited advice. And so what David said was that Phillips's legislative record was not great. He was very much a sort of a glad hander, but he had to work very closely with Metro and with the Metro chairman, and the big project and the game-changing project that time was the filling out of the Yonge Street and the University Avenue and Bloor Danforth subway lines. And so the city and Metro had to work closely together with that. And much of the construction of those two subway lines happened while he was mayor. So that's a pretty significant legacy.
Yes, I would definitely say that was a significant legacy that we all have taken advantage of to this day. A question for Bonnie is, which of Daphne's paintings is your favorite and why?
Oh my goodness. I think that my favorite painting by Daphne Odjig is something called From Mother Earth Flows the River of Life. And actually, it's not included in the slide list that we showed this evening. The reason that I love that painting, aside from its thematic content about the ecology and about the earth, is the painting style. During the time that Daphne was emerging as an Indigenous painter, the field was dominated by men and predominantly by Norval Morrisseau and people who were painting in the style of Norval Morrisseau. He had established something called the Woodland School, which I'm sure, most Canadians are aware of. Very flat planes of color surrounded by a black form line, extremely colorful, very evocative picture making. And Daphne defied that. She broke the stereotypical way that Indigenous artists were expected to paint in those days. And she really was the first one to paint her own style, to break that form line, to break the picture plane, and to paint in an expressive way about something that mattered deeply to her, which was the earth and the survival of the earth. And so for me, that's an important picture, not only in Daphne's work, but I think it's an important picture in Canadian art history, because it begins the flowering of a whole bunch of expression by Indigenous artists who were no longer needed to be bound by the expectations of non-Indigenous Canadians, could just paint the way that they wanted to.
I'm wondering, Bonnie, given that it's your favorite work of Daphne's, why you didn't include it in your presentation?
Well, it was hard to contextualize because, and this is another reason why I love it so much, it kind of comes out of nowhere. There are several trajectories of Daphne's works that you can follow, and you can see, though, this was that theme and that was that theme, and they kind of fit into pretty neat categories. But this picture, I think, really represents a break in that line of thinking and goes into a very different place. So I couldn't really, without going into a lot of detail about, what she was exploring, like the intellectual content of her art, I just couldn't find a way to fit it in. But I wish I had, because then I could, then everyone would know what I'm talking about when I talk about that picture.
Well, I'm glad you had the opportunity to talk about it at least. Thank you. Rebecka, you mentioned before your presentation, you mentioned Transgender National Awareness Week. And I'm wondering if you can speak more about how trans women influenced the lesbian organizing in Toronto in the 70s.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure I'm the best person to answer it, to be honest. I don't identify as trans or non-binary. But I think one of the things that I encounter over and over again is that in the 1970s, trans people were part of the lesbian feminist movement. But the relationship between cisgender, meaning that you are non-trans, and transgender wasn't always comfortable. And so there was a tension that evolved in a lot of activism at that time. I think the modern, or what we think of now as a transgender movement, really hits its stride in the late 90s, moving into the 2000s to today, where we actually recognize the distinct and important needs of trans community over and above or separate from a lesbian or LGBTQ movement. So I think in the 70s, what you see are people really trying to articulate for the first time a lesbian and gay identity. And I use those terms specifically because the term queer was also not a term that was used as anything other than a pejorative term against queer people in the 1970s. So I would say we were all still trying to find out who we are at that time. I would also say there's been some great work done by an anthropologist named Esther Newton, who really talks about queer people having to be anthropologists of their own identities when we come out. And so really trying to understand who we are, what we are like, who our community is, because it is not always obvious. And imagine, 600 people coming together for a comedy show or a musical night and a banquet would be quite a moment of community solidarity that hadn't really happened before, especially in Canada. So I think that question is probably something better answered by, I think, a few of the people on our membership list here tonight who've been reaching out, but definitely tense relationships, but also a period of really lesbian identity and formation.
Well, we definitely invite the members of our audience to share their thoughts in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. And of course, to ask your questions in the Q&A. We have a question in the Q&A about where people can go to learn more about each of your stories. Maybe we can start with Arlene.
Oh, okay. I mean, just to learn more about what I'm doing?
Or I think the question is about to learn more about the story of your mom.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for clarifying. Yes, there are a few websites. We have Jean Lumb Foundation, and if you go there, there are quite a lot of photos and narrative about my mother's story. I did write a children's book called The Spirit of the Dragon, Story of Jean Lumb, a Proud Chinese Canadian. It was a children's book that I wrote. It was the very first book that I ever wrote. And again, it was because there was such a lack of information out there, and so much had been written about my mother in newspapers and magazine articles, but there was really nothing for children. So that's why I wrote that book. And I also have written for the Canadian Encyclopedia. So if you go there, I think the link was posted in the chat sideline that I wrote an article about my mother in Canadian Encyclopedia. And if you do a Google search, you will find a lot of citations about my mother. And especially if you go into any of the newspaper magazine databases, you'll find a lot about my mother there as well. Thanks for asking.
John, do you want to share some places, some resources?
I'm gonna mention a book that I read at some point in the pandemic, which I found really eye-opening. A lot of what I've written about in terms of the city and its history is about, how Toronto went from being this very, very Anglo place to, a city that's considered to be the most diverse place on the planet. And there are all sorts of explanations for that have nothing to do with local politics. But one of the interesting questions is what was here before, and so there's a book called Toronto, the Belfast of Canada, which is by a guy named William Smythe, who's a historian, and I believe he's based in Ireland, and it's about the history of Orange politics in Toronto. Now, this is the book is somewhat dry, so a little warning there, but it's really fascinating to read because it talks about how entrenched this particular type of politics was in the city. And so just to give you a couple of illustrations, you almost had to belong to the Orange Order if you wanted a decent job at City Hall, if you wanted to serve on City Council, if you wanted to sort of succeed in business. I mean, some of the, very prominent Canadian or Toronto business people were part of that world. And it was incredibly conservative. I cover politics and urban policy for a bunch of different publications, and it's actually possible to find habits that we still participate in, or that we still sort of fall back on, that can be traced to the conservatism of that period. And so in a way, the city's history is about this clash between this very solid, very sort of impenetrable Protestant politics and all the new and interesting things that were brought to the city by people who didn't belong in that world. And that book really kind of explains sort of former part of that story.
Thank you, John. Bonnie, do you want to share anything?
Sure. Actually, there are quite a lot of works available that talk about Daphne's life and the way that her art formed her identity. So I went to my bookshelf and grabbed some of them. This is the catalog for the Daphne Odjig exhibition, and it has a full biography in it. And this is available through the National Gallery. It's called Daphne Odjig, The Drawings and Paintings. The Nanabush Tales, they're little small books, and they're available through the Art Gallery of Peterborough has a full set of them that you can buy. I think you can get them online as well. There's an article online at the Canadian Encyclopedia. So if you Google Canadian Encyclopedia and search for Daphne Odjig, there's quite an informative article there. And finally, I would be very remiss if I didn't mention Stan Somerville. Stan is Daphne's son. He manages the copyright for all of Daphne's images. They're available to look at on the website that he runs. It's called ojig.com. He gave us permission to reproduce all of the images that we use to illustrate the story tonight. And there's a lot of information there about Daphne and her work and her life.
Thanks, Bonnie. Rebecka, do you have any resources?
What's fascinating is that the story is sort of so hidden that there isn't a real clear writing about it. And so I really had to go to the source, which were some of the people who were there and attended it. And I also had to go to the archives. There are a couple of places that you could find reading. One of them is Becky Ross's book, The House That Jill Built, but unfortunately it's out of print. So I would point people who are interested in learning more about two-spirit, lesbian, bi, trans, gay history to actually look at Any Other Way, which is probably behind me on the shelf somewhere. And there's a note I see in the chat about that. Any Other Way is edited by John Lorinc and others, including myself, and it really brings together a selection of stories in these kind of beautiful 2-3 page snapshots of Toronto and how Toronto became queer. And I think that's probably where I would direct people.
Thanks, Rebecka. And just to let everyone know, we'll be sharing all of these resources with you after the program, along with all the links and resources we've shared already in the chat. So if you didn't manage to scribble that down quickly, we'll be sure to share that with you after the program. We have a question for Arlene, asking if you could share your memories of dancing with your mother's dance troupe, in particular the command performance for Queen Elizabeth II in Ottawa.
Yes, the dance group was called the Chinese Community Dancers of Ontario, and it was sponsored by the Chinese community. And it's just another way for my mother. One of her most influential mentors was Pauline McGibbon, who later became the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. And Polly McGibbon said to my mother, she said, Jean, you've done so much work in the community. You really should now start going outside of the community and talking about the Chinese culture and Chinese food. And that's when my mother started doing all these speaking engagements, talking about food. Again, breaking down barriers, building awareness of the Chinese community. And so Chinese food, of course, is one part of Chinese culture, and another aspect is Chinese dance. So my mother put together this dance troupe, and what we did, and of course, there are 3 girls in my family. There were 6 kids in our family, and I have my 2 younger sisters, and one of my younger sisters is participating this evening. She signed in from Montreal, but we all were trained by teachers who came from Hong Kong and from Taiwan. So we learned a lot of dances, and because we were probably the first Chinese dance group in Toronto, we were very popular. So we performed at many events inside the Chinese community, especially, and then also outside the Chinese community. And we, in fact, traveled across Canada because we became very, very popular and in demand. We traveled across Canada. And the whole idea for the 1967 Canada's Centennial Party, which was going to be celebrated on Parliament Hill, groups were asked to audition to perform for that day. So our group auditioned, and we were chosen as the only Chinese group to perform that day. So there were only about a dozen performances, and we had to. So we were all bussed into Ottawa, and we did 2 performances, one on June 30th and one on July 1st. And they were all on the Parliament Hill outside. We had fabulous weather, thankfully. And after the performance, all the organizers or leaders of each of the 12 groups that had been selected were presented to the Queen. So it was that's the picture I showed, my mother waiting to be presented to Queen Elizabeth II. So it was a huge honor for us. And it was a wonderful experience for us because the dance troupe, there must have been about 30 of us that went to Ottawa, and just the whole adventure of knowing that we're going to be performing for the Queen, and we were stayed at the accommodation that was provided for us, and we were all about the same age, so it was a huge adventure for us to be given this honor. And the costumes that we used were costumes that were on loan to us by the various Chinese Dramatic Society and Chinese Cantonese opera groups that were very active in Toronto, because Cantonese opera was very, very popular in Toronto. And so we wore the costumes from on loan from these various dramatic and music societies. So it was a really exciting time. One of my fond memories of growing up and being totally immersed in one aspect of Chinese culture.
In the vein of your own personal memories and experiences, I'm wondering, Bonnie, what it was like for you working with Daphne for her retrospective exhibition at the National Gallery, and if you can share a little bit more about that experience.
Sure, I'd love to. Many people have talked about Daphne's kindness, and I experienced it firsthand. I first met her in 2003 when I was working as a set designer for a play about her life. And that's when I realized that here was this gem of a Canadian artist who was virtually unknown, except to a small number of Indigenous fans. And then when I worked with her on the exhibition, she was just, she was just so interested in the whole the prospect of having a major retrospective in a public gallery. She was the first woman of Indigenous heritage to have a solo exhibition at the National Gallery. They had an exhibition of Inuit art before this, but and that was, 2008. I mean, this is quite recent that, suddenly the major galleries are realizing that there's a whole there's a whole school of art happening here in Canada that has been overlooked and not really celebrated. And so Daphne was really aware of that. She was already 80 years old at the time, but she was really up for that challenge of opening that door for other artists of color, and particularly artists of Indigenous ancestry, and particularly women, that they would have an opportunity to show work at a venue like that. And so seeing her courage and determination and how formidable she was, incredibly intelligent person, scary, smart, but kind and gentle and generous. So it changed my life as an artist to work with her. It influenced my work, not so much stylistically, but the root of my work, like where to draw my inspiration from, came from my time with her.
Thank you, Bonnie. I think we have one more. I think we have time for one more question, I think I will ask. This is kind of like a. This is not a last question. But one of the questions we have is with the historical weight of the people and moments you talk about, what was the process of putting these stories together like for you? So maybe we'll go to Rebecka.
Sure, thank you. Well, I had the great privilege of once working for the archives with a Q. There's a note from Sarah on the chat here about the archives, formerly known as the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. So I was familiar with a lot of the timeline, the content, the people who were involved in this conference, as well as other conferences and meetings or gatherings that took place in Toronto. And so my first inclination was to just reach out to the people who I knew in the community and start asking questions. I talked to Amy Gottlieb, who I mentioned in my story. I spoke with Susan Sturman, who was the guitarist and songwriter for Mama Kia 2, and I just kept going from there. And eventually found Robin and Shelley and was able to talk to them about their experience as well. But really, I think what challenged me the most in putting together this story is that due to the pandemic, the archives was closed to researchers through most of my research phase. And I'm sure this has frustrated many grad students and historians and researchers over the past 20 months. But thank goodness they are more than happy to help as much as possible with accessing digital files. And of course, it's been said in the chat already, the Rise Up Digital Feminist Archives Online was just an incredible resource. The Binational Conference produced a program that's several pages long that lists all the events, all of the places that the events took place. But you know what it doesn't do is list the names of the people who were involved. And so that took a little bit of sleuthing to find out who was who. And I suspect that has a lot to do with the fact that people were scared to put their names on a program like that in 1979. So a lot of people are listed by first name only, and I had to do a little bit of putting things together in order to find those people in real time.
Thank you so much, Rebecka. And thank you to Arlene, John, and Bonnie as well for such a wonderful evening of storytelling. I'd like to give a special thanks to the featured storytellers in our stories, Elder Duke Redbird, Robin Tyler, and Shelley Robertson. Thank you to all the individuals and institutions that gave permission to use the images, videos, and music featured in tonight's stories, with special thanks to Stan Somerville, the archives, Rise Up Feminist Archives, and more. We'll be providing full story credits at the end of the program, so please stick around for that. I'd like to give a huge shout out to our incredible team at MyZeum. Thank you so much for the care and the hard work that you put into everything that you do. And finally, thank you to everyone who joined us this evening and stayed with us all the way through. Thank you so much for coming. Please join us again on Wednesday, December the 8th at 7 p.m. for Derailed, the History of Black Railway Porters in Canada, a conversation exploring the history and lived experiences of Black railway porters and their fight for equality on and off the tracks. You can find more information in our chat, on our website, museumoftoronto.com, or you can sign up for a newsletter to stay up to date on all upcoming museum programming. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.